everyone. My name is Adrienne Michelle. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. And today we're going to be talking a lot about gender and sexual diversity, specifically as it relates to the faith community. A little bit about myself. I'm a therapist, educator, and speaker who kind of started out in sex education. So very early on started learning more so about the things around shame, the things around bodies, and very understanding of the lessons that were taught very early on. So as I just share a little bit about myself throughout this webinar, I do want to start by saying that in every society, it's important to recognize that there are dominant ideas about gender, about sex, and about sexuality. And the dominant idea about gender is usually that there are only two genders. The way we identify or are told to behave is linked to only two sexes, the physical characteristics of our bodies, male and female. And this is sometimes referred to as the gender binary system. And as we talk today, I want us to understand that there are so many myths that also go along with gender and sexual diversity, and we'll be debunking those as well. But in the mental health field, something that I learned a lot about is gender and sexuality and as it relates to the faith community and the spirituality of my clients. And so I find that understanding gender and sexual diversity is a key component of being able to talk through faith, being able to talk through spirituality, and things like that. And so moving forward, we're seeing that myth one is that sometimes we don't see women as natural leaders. Historically, women have been excluded from political and religious leadership positions and denied the right to vote, right, or participate as equal citizens. And this is keeping in mind that it's linked to the gender binary, in which the qualities that are thought to make good leaders and often people who are assigned male, right? And the qualities of female counterparts are unable to attain. As with all stereotypes, the belief has been constructed by people. This is also known as social construction. And so when we talk about gender and we talk about sexual diversity, it's really important to understand that it's a social construct. So as you can see, the purpose of this webinar is really to explore the cultural implications of faith leaders who work with clients who are struggling with substance abuse with an emphasis on gender and sexual diversity. I'm really hopeful that you all will be able to develop culturally relevant understanding of LGBTQ and faith communities with a special correlation to substance use disorders, develop provider awareness of what impacts one's decision and biases as well, to adapt and alter attitudes when working with people specifically, and just build the cultural competency altogether so that the barriers that we are looking at are not continued through the therapy process. So as I was talking about with myths, understanding that people are not recruited into homosexuality, that is another myth, right? Understanding that there's no evidence to support that notion that people can be made gay or made lesbian, just as there's no evidence to show that gay, lesbian, or bisexual people can be straight, right? Another myth, and specifically when we work with communities, is understanding the racial component as well. This idea that homosexuality is un-African, and recognizing that African history is filled with examples of erotic and non-erotic same-sex relationships as well. And so as we go through today, it's important to understand that we want to remove the barriers for the LGBT community and give them access to your services, right? So as you can see in the first picture here, you can see that, people are trying to, struggle to even see over the fence. And we call that equality, right? Just giving people the same things all the time. And so the second picture will show, equity, right? The goal is to give somebody maybe more. And that isn't the case because all the time that doesn't help, especially when we're talking about access to services. So just keep in mind that we're just trying to remove the barriers here when we are discussing and talking about the community. And so our agenda today will be talking about addiction and the LGBTQ community with special correlation to faith communities. We'll do some gender education, we'll talk about some barriers, and we'll also do some therapeutic approaches. And so first off, I think it's important to understand that addiction in the LGBTQ community there are 5 statistics that I think is important for everyone to know, right? And so starting off, 50% of substance abuse counselors have no formal training with LGBTQ issues or how they relate to substance abuse, right? And so I think it's important to understand that as clinicians, very often we will feel unequipped or like we don't have the education or the language to connect with these clients. And it's important to realize that most people are. Most people don't have the training and specific things that you need to connect with this community, right? And so understanding that everyone that has the education and resources have had to reach out and get it themselves. So just even by taking this webinar, you're doing something that is specific training on working with those with LGBTQ issues and how that relates to substance abuse. The second thing is understanding that members of a sexual minority are twice as likely or more than twice as likely to use drugs as the general population, right? And so understanding that is important because I very often will say that the first places that LGBTQ folks get to, spend time and be close to each other might be faith communities, right? But what happens if you come out and you're rejected by that faith community? What is the next place where young people are able to connect and talk through things specifically based on these identities? And I very often will say those are bars, right? Like the area that you're living in may not have a rec center, may not have a specific place for the youth to go, but they probably do have a bar and they probably do have a gay bar. And so understanding that that is part of the component as well. Also understanding that problems start very early, right? Adolescents in general are about 90% more likely to use substances than their heterosexual counterparts. And recognizing that 26% of respondents to a national transgender health survey said that they've abused drugs and alcohol in response to rejection from their families. And what we do know about trans folks and a lot of LGBTQ folks is that they often will face rejection by their families, and that includes the rejection by their faith community. The next one is verbal and physical abuse, right? And so recognizing that 42% of trans people have reported verbal or physical abuse or denial of equal treatment when visiting doctors. And so I will say that a lot of the LGBTQ community feels, a little bit worried about going to healthcare facilities, going to healthcare communities, talking with their physician because they are having to explain and do a lot of education. And so it's really important to understand that if your clients aren't necessarily feeling well enough to go to the doctor, it takes a lot more vulnerability for them to come to therapy, for them to talk with someone in their faith leadership, for them to talk with someone who's going to understand many components of their life. And so recognizing that substance abuse might be a part of coming out, and coming out is hard enough. And so recognizing that having to do both of those things in the same space when they are fearful that their community, meaning the faith community, might reject them, it's important to understand. And speaking of rejection, this idea that people are not welcome, right? And so understanding that 7.3% of US treatment centers offer specialized programs for LGBT clients. That's not a lot, right? And so recognizing what that says or what even that percentage and outcome says to the community. So when we talk about gender and sexual diversity, it's really important to understand what are we talking about really? Like what does all of this mean? And so when we talk about gender, it's important to understand that it's complicated, right? It's not just one specific thing. Maybe if we were dealing with not having stereotypes, not being a social construct, and I want to recognize like what I mean by social construct. It doesn't mean to diminish the word gender, but to talk about men and women, to recognize that here, especially in the United States, when we talk about men, we have certain connotations that we have and certain mindsets that we have based on the experiences or the lived experiences of what we expect from men and what we expect from women. And so we have stereotypes and we've constructed this idea that socially, this is what is acceptable for a man, this is what is acceptable for a female. And it's important to recognize that as a social construct, just as money is a social construct. We know that money is paper, right? And so understanding that it has no meaning unless we put meaning to it. And so this idea that gender is something that is created it's important to recognize that it's assigned, right? And so that's why I'm going to be using assigned sex today as we talk about gender and sexual diversity, because biological sex makes it seem like we do some type of testing. And we know from a healthcare perspective, we know from a medical perspective, we know that that's just simply not true. They bring out a ruler, you are assigned male and female, right? And so next we have the gender expression. That is going to be a huge part of gender, right? The way we express our gender here in the United States might be, you know, with our clothing, our makeup, our hair, our nails, our glasses. You know, there's so many ways to communicate gender, right? And so your gender expression is completely based on very often the stereotypes. And then we have your gender identity, right? And that's how you identify yourself. And it's really important to understand that out of the three of these components of gender, gender identity is going to be the only thing that you are in control of, right? We're not necessarily in control of what we were assigned at birth. Sometimes we're in control of our gender expression, but maybe not very often. And so your gender identity is going to be the one thing that your client can control. And so that is why it's really important to not question someone's gender identity, right? As we're talking through this today, recognizing the gender identity is the only thing that they can truly have ownership of. So it's really important to affirm that identity and not reject or question that identity. So as we talk about assigned sex today, it's really important to also understand the assignment of intersex. And so assigned sexes that we have so far right now are male, female, and intersex. And so we've heard of male before, we've heard of female before. I just want to get into intersex a little bit for those of you who may not have a good understanding of what that means. And so intersex is a term to describe somebody who has ambiguous reproductive organs. So that might be someone who has ovaries and has a penis but doesn't realize it until later on in life. This might be a difference in their chromosomes. This might even be a difference in the amount of testosterone or estrogen in someone's system. And so understanding that this idea of intersex isn't very far-fetched, it's actually very common. It's not as rare as you would think. And so if you all could just take a moment and ask yourself if you've ever met a redhead before, right? Have you ever met someone who's naturally a redhead? And so I asked that question because, to put it in perspective, there are more intersex folks than redheads here in our nation. And so realistically, it's about 1 in 1,000, if not more, right? And so that's a statistic from about 10 years ago. But I am wondering if with the more gender and sexual diversity education we all are having, people will be able to more identify with the term intersex. And so recognizing that intersex is a term and is an assigned sex at this point is really important, because as we talk about these terms, it's important to understand what the assignments have been labeled in the past. And so before we move any further, it's really important to understand this term cisgender. Now, I am also a cisgender provider. I do identify as a queer person. I'm also African American. I'm also pretty femme. And so recognizing what the term cisgender means, it's just a person who identifies as the sex that they were assigned at birth. Cis just coming from the Latin prefix meaning same, or on the same side as. And so cisgender just means I still identify with the gender that I was assigned at birth. Now, it's really important for me to say that too, because as a cisgender provider, I do have a struggle with talking about all of these many identities. But as a healthcare provider, I find it important to make sure that everyone is very understanding and has the language to have these conversations with their clients because of that barrier that we talked about earlier. Now, again, like I said earlier, gender identity is your own, right? And even when you look at this slide, recognizing that you can take many pieces of what might be considered masculine, what you might consider feminine, what you might even consider androgynous, and really understanding that it's your own. You know, no one has full authority on what you can and cannot do, but we do have perceptions in this society, and that's what we're going to move into as well. So when we talk about identity versus expression, it's important to know that we definitely make assumptions, right? Like if someone has a dress on or they have on makeup, we may assume that they identify as female. And when somebody has on a suit and a full beard, we assume that they identify as male. But it's really important to understand that identity is internal, right? It's not something that you can see. And so as we move forward into sexual orientation as well, I want to give you a really easy way to maintain and understand how your identity is also different from your sexual orientation. And so as we talk today, it's important to recognize your identity, right? Your gender identity is who you go to bed as. Your sexual orientation may be who you go to bed with, right? And so that's a really easy way to see how separate that is. And so in talking about the gender, I want us to really come to terms with these two very different models of looking at gender. And one of them is going to be the binary. And so the gender binary is a concept based on societal norms that there are only two genders, male or female, right? It is the idea that we operate on the binary on two different platforms. And so realistically, the gender binary says if you're not male or you're not female, you have to do whatever you need to fit into this box. And so as we learn about gender and sexual diversity and how the past has impacted us today, in about 10 to 15 years ago, if you were born intersex, what they would do is suggest or persuade really the parents to do surgery to make you fit into one or either box. And so understanding that this idea of the gender binary does have some harmful things that have come out of it, and understanding that that is something that has happened in our society and that trans folks or intersex folks are worried about. They may not fit into this gender binary and they may not want to. However, there are trans folks that do believe in the binary. And so one way to think about that as we move forward is someone who believes in transitioning from male to female, right? That person believes in the binary. The second concept that we're going through today is the gender spectrum, right? And so understanding that there's a difference between a binary and a spectrum. So the spectrum indicates that belief is that gender is neither or, right? It's not either male or female. There is a very large spectrum where you can place masculinity, femininity all across it, right? And so understanding that the gender spectrum is one concept, the gender binary is another. Now, when we do talk about gender, it's important to also discuss non-binary folks, right? And so those folks who will identify as non-binary, when you ask yourself, is this person cisgender or not, or transgender, right? And so as we move forward and understand the many definitions of transgender and the umbrella term that transgender is, you have to recognize too that non-binary is underneath that trans umbrella because that person does not identify with what they were assigned at birth. Right? So even if it is not what you are perceiving as the opposite gender, if you're a binary thinker, if you're a spectrum thinker, recognizing that this person identifies wherever on the spectrum, but just does not identify with either gender. And so recognizing that some transgender people identify outside of the gender binary, they may not feel themselves to be completely male or female. There are various non-binary identities as language evolves, and keeping in mind that there are gender identities that are beyond male and female. Also shows that research is indicating that younger trans people are really, really identifying outside of the binary. And so I know that I can identify with young people who are coming out and really understanding gender as being non-binary or genderqueer or gender fluid. And even though we will go over those terms, it's important to understand that that community or that group of young people are trans individuals, right? They are changing the system and understand that they are not going to be using the typical pronouns that we're expecting. And so we'll get through that today, but it's important to recognize the non-binary identity. And so moving forward, as we look at gender expression and how we communicate gender, I just want you to take a look at this person on the screen. And let's just think about what is purposeful or accidental with the way that they are expressing gender right now. And so thinking through, okay, what might be purposeful, what might be accidental? what went on in your mind may have been, oh, the makeup and maybe the eyelashes, maybe even the hair, right? We don't know how this person may go to work. It's important to know that the other side can be something that is purposeful too. You know, that mustache could be drawn on, even those hairs could be drawn on, right? And so being mindful of what shows up as gender bias in our minds versus how this person might be communicating gender. And so we may not know how this person identifies specifically, but we may want to ask. And so a very easy way to connect with someone when you are not sure of their gender expression or how they are identifying themselves is going to be to introduce yourself, right? And so when I introduce myself, very typically, I will say, my name is Adrienne Michelle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, right? And what that does immediately is it opens the door for someone else to share their pronouns and how they are communicating gender and what they have felt is important when communicating gender. And so as we move forward in the trans umbrella, we have two words on here that we no longer use. And I just want you to take a moment and scan it to see if you can identify the two words that we don't use anymore. So if you thought to yourself, two-spirit, I would say that you are wrong. And so two-spirit is a word to for those who identify as maybe transgender but are of Native American descent. And so understanding that the term two-spirit is just for someone who is of Native American descent and identifies as perhaps trans or third gender or non-binary. And so the two words that we no longer use are going to be cross-dresser and transsexual. And it's important to recognize that we don't use the term transsexual anymore for several reasons. One of which is because it's been deemed a derogatory term, but the other reason also is because there places this class difference within the trans community, right? And so transsexual used to be to describe someone who has had the surgeries to physically transition. And so being mindful that that means that that person has the maybe resources to do so, maybe financial resources, maybe community support or support to go ahead and transition in a way that someone else didn't. And so that speaks to the privilege that even happens within the community. So understanding that term really separates trans folks as opposed to bringing them together. However, it is on this form because some people may not have the term transgender or may not identify with the term transgender if English is not their native language. And so very often I will find those who have English as their second language, maybe they might identify as transsexual. So that is why it is still there. And the next term is going to be cross-dresser. And so cross-dressing is an action. And so realistically, unless your client identifies as a cross-dresser or says that they cross-dress at home, they are kind of going to be on the outer end of the trans umbrella because cross-dressing is an action and not an identity. So that's important to remember. So the other terms I want to go over with you all are going to be genderqueer, gender fluid, and gender nonconforming, right? And so we know that gender nonconforming is a term that we can kind of easily understand, right? This person does not conform to the specific gender identity or these specific stereotypes. And we may know someone who's gender nonconforming if we just think for a second. They may not identify as gender nonconforming, but they may not conform with the typical gender stereotypes, right? Someone who's gender fluid is going to be fluid throughout their gender spectrum, right? And so maybe a combination of masculinity and femininity, perhaps even identifying as more androgynous, right? And so understanding that. Someone who's genderqueer is kind of going to be in a similar circle with that, right? So understanding what queer identity is really important. And I'm recognizing that more in the South, a lot of people are identifying with queer. However, a lot of African Americans are not identifying as queer. And so if someone identifies as genderqueer or just a queer person, you kind of want to inquire about what that means for them so that they can explain that queer identity, because it is not something that is just a blanket term across the board. We've gone over non-binary. And now let's move forward to the other side of transgender before we get into the pronouns. And so again, transgender is going to be a term to describe someone who does not identify as the gender that they were assigned at birth. A trans woman is used to describe that someone who is AMAB, right? And so this is another really quick tip in how to help someone identify or gather information. It is important to understand why you're gathering that information, though. And so a trans woman is going to be someone who's assigned male at birth who transitioned, right? And so someone who's a trans woman identifies as female, identifies as woman, may not even identify as a trans woman, but perhaps was assigned male at birth or assigned intersex at birth. A trans man is going to describe someone who will be the opposite of that, right? So this is going to be someone who's AFAB, that's AFAB, and for trans woman, that's going to be AMAB, and so that just means assigned female at birth. And so a trans man, they're just saying that they are a man with trans experience, right? And so recognizing what that means. The term MTF and FTM are separate from that, right? So that is going to be male to female, female to male. It tends to be more of medical terms, and then that client may break down and share with you. And so that just means male to female, female to male. It's also important to understand that that community who identifies MTF, FTM might also identify with binary, right? And understanding that they believe there are only two sexes, right? And so keeping that in mind as we move forward today. When we talk about pronouns, there are a few that we're used to, right? We're used to she, her, hers, and we're used to he, him, his. Some that we may not be as used to using are they, them, theirs, sie, zer, zers, or sie, them, sims, right? And so those are going to be gender neutral pronouns. Typically, people are using they, them as their pronouns, but I have seen sie, zer, and sie, them primarily in the northeastern states. And so recognizing that someone who uses they, them pronouns simply identify outside of the binary. If anyone is using these gender neutral pronouns, all you have to do is understand that they are outside of the binary. Don't let it throw you off as a clinician or as a faith leader because it is just explaining that they identify outside of that binary. So something that I find really helpful too is to have up in my office, or at least to be willing to understand this gender unicorn, because this could be closely tied to someone's substance abuse, someone's secrecy, someone's behavior, which we know are the clear signs of someone struggling with substance abuse, right? And so when we talk through gender identity, gender expression, your sex assigned at birth, who you're sexually attracted to and who you're romantically and emotionally attracted to, it's really important to allow your clients to understand those can be different. And it is okay if they're different. It is not a crisis. It is not something to be worried about or scared of, right? And so recognizing that these can be different. When we're talking about the Bible, especially though, for the faith leaders there, it's important to recognize that biblical writers really didn't share our contemporary understanding of gender and sexual diversity, right? Any same-sex behavior that biblical writers may have witnessed was either outside the bonds of heterosexual marriage and so associated with, pagan faiths. And it was therefore double stigmatized, and understanding what that means, right? Also, that same-sex expression was condemned largely for crossing boundaries of gender, specifically men viewed as abandoning their active role in intercourse to be passive with other men, and women perceived as abandoning their passive role to be active with women, right? And so understanding the connotation that means and the messages that have been sent down to basically say that someone can't identify that way because it condemns this or because it proves this, and recognizing that that isn't the case, right? And so it's really important to understand the interpretation of the time that the Bible was written and even faith communities 10, 15, 20 years ago, as opposed to understanding and taking note and understanding gender and sexuality today. And so gender expression and your presentation, we've gone through that and kind of what that means, right? Your sex assigned at birth, who you're sexually, romantically, and emotionally attracted to might be different. And being able to just talk through this with clients and talk through their attraction. And it's important to think about how they feel about it, how they feel they've been perceived with it, either by family or by their community, faith community, chosen family, all of that, and being mindful of that. And so as we move forward, thinking through the concerns that the community has, the first one is going to be discrimination, right? Like clients fear being treated differently. And so if I'm an LGBTQ person who's trying to get help for substance abuse at a place that is predominantly like a faith community, am I going to be worried about coming out? Yes, you betcha. You know, am I going to be worried that I'm going to have to face social stigma or discrimination, prejudice, denial of my human rights, abuse, even harassment, victimization? Of course, right? And another part of discrimination is recognizing that if a trans person really wants to come into your office, do you have a place for them to safely just use the restroom? You know, and just being mindful of that. What discrimination looks like for this community means, am I able to talk about my family? Am I able to talk about my community support, my chosen family, right? And so one thing that I always suggest clinicians or, you know, people who just want a more in-depth understanding of like LGBTQ communities go to, let's watch the show Pose, right? It's a show on Netflix, originally on FX. It's such a good representation of what mostly trans women of color specifically go through. And so recognizing that this discrimination can cause what we're looking at as minority stress, right? This stress that only the specific community is going through and feeling. And we know that African American communities experience that. We know South Asian communities experience that. We know religious communities experience that. And so being mindful of minority stress and how that might be a contributor to your client being worried about their substance use or even being a part of the education is going to be the next barrier, right? And so recognizing that having to be the expert in your own therapy and provide education to the provider, it feels draining and upsetting, right? If I'm coming to you for support, I don't want to have to educate you on who I am and what my identity means and why I have that identity. And that's why it's important to go ahead and affirm the person's identity and then learn about it, right? And so to make sure that you're open and willing to have this conversation so that the client doesn't feel like they are having to do their own work. The next thing is going to be recognizing what confidentiality looks like, and it may be different for those clients in those communities, right? You know, even as I think about, you know, working as a counselor, as I did with this organization in New Jersey, working with people who are infected and affected by HIV, who are also substance users, right? Recognizing that those who were also in the LGBTQ communities felt like they weren't able to share and talk through certain things with their heterosexual counterparts, right? And so how was I connecting with them, right? And keeping their confidentiality sacred, right? Even when you think down to the forms that you have or how you call someone to be in your office, are you calling by their first name or their last name? Are you recognizing that they have a preferred name written down as opposed to their legal name, right? And so being mindful about that. The next thing we're going to talk about is families. And I talked a little bit about that when I was sharing about the show Pose. That is really an interesting way to also understand what chosen family is. And so biological family is the family that you're born with, right? And your chosen family, again, something you get to choose. And so recognizing that a lot of LGBTQ folks will have chosen family due to loss, due to discrimination, due to being rejected by their families and their communities. And they may be wanting to talk about and have more of an understanding, for you to have more of an understanding about their chosen family as opposed to their biological family, right? Chosen family are the people that they've grown up with, you know, the people who were possibly in those gay bars with them, even the people who may have introduced them to certain substances, the people that they're either far away from or too close to, right? And so being mindful about asking about the community's chosen family. It's also important to encourage clients to seek out support in community, right? How well connected are you all with the support that the LGBTQ community has in your specific area, right? And so constantly encouraging clients, seek out support. You know, you're not the only trans woman who comes here. You're not the only non-binary person who comes here. There's some support figures in, you know, peer support. There might be some support resources that you can connect them to. And speaking of resources, just being mindful that you seek out trainings and make yourself known at local centers and have suggestions for clients, whether psychiatric services, medical, or even social needs within LGBTQ communities, right? If I have a client who is struggling with gender or their sexuality or just, you know, wanting to connect with people around that, I should have resources available for them, just as I would have resources available for another client of mine. Now, in working with substance abuse, I know sometimes we end up doing a lot of work with families. And so it's important to have this understanding about the barriers with families, right? So the first one is going to be understanding versus education, right? I say very often that, someone's parents might be a lot older, may not have experienced any type of sexual education, especially for those of us who are living in the South right now, right? So if they haven't had any formal sexual education, they have had this gender expansive education either. And so helping families reach for understanding, right, as well as education is important. Also, the loss, right? What does doing family system work with a client look like when they're no longer connected with their family or friendships, right? So understanding how loss has been a huge part of their life. The next one is going to be truth telling and trust, right? And so how often have these clients been keeping secrets? Who can they trust in these communities to be close with, to confide in, to talk with, to stay strong with, right? And so being mindful of that. Now, the therapeutic techniques that I would most certainly feel are the most effective when working with LGBT, the clients who have the correlation or the comorbidity of substance use and needing some therapeutic work, whether they have anxiety, whether they have depression and things like that. And if they identify as LGBTQ as well as being in a faith community, it's important that we're LGBTQ affirmative, right? It's important that we practice from a place of affirming identity as opposed to rejecting identity. And that's just basic for having this non-judgmental space that someone is supposed to come to you with, right? Not even the judgments that the faith community has had in the past is going to be helpful with connecting with this client, right? And so if your goal is to support the client, help them understand themselves, help them work through secrecy and past trauma, help them stay clean, help them do all of these things, we have to operate from a place of affirming their identity. The next technique is going to be taking an intersectional perspective. I know I shared with you all that I am a Black, queer, femme, cisgender person. Can also identify as a lesbian as well. And so I say all that to say that it's important to have an intersectional perspective when working with these clients. I'm not only a gay female, I am a female, I am African American. And so if you focus on just one identity, you're not going to get the full scope of things. And something I say very often is, sometimes how people are like, we're onions, you peel one layer back and you get the other layer. Well, in none of my days have they peeled back my Blackness and saw me as a lesbian and saw me as a woman and all of these things. I'm more like a garlic clove. All of those identities are there all the time, and the experience of those are there all the time. And so it's really important to help someone understand that. The next one is going to be family-based attachment therapy. And this is a practice where you meet with the family, you meet with the individual, you kind of go back and forth to help a client understand their attachment injuries until they are ready to move forward and talk with their family. I suggest doing this or having the option to do this both with biological family as well as chosen family. And so being mindful of that. The next one is going to be empty chair, right? And so some of you might be familiar with this technique, but remember earlier when I was saying, how can we do family systems work without the family? Well, it's important to bring them and their experience in the room, even if they can't physically be there. And so very often I will ask my client to, let's say, write a letter and pretend that that person is sitting next to you, even going as far as bringing an empty chair into the room or into the space and allowing them to think, okay, that family member is there, that person who hurt you is there, that person that inflicted this trauma on you is there. Speak to them. What do you wish that you could say to them? And allow it to be a place of healing for them. And so your individual commitments are going to be to intervene, right? You want to be able to intervene when you recognize that something negative is happening, whether someone is being misgendered, whether somebody is not being as confidential as they should be. And so recognizing that intervening is going to be an important part of connecting with this community. The next thing is going to be remaining mindful, right? We talked about a lot of mindful practices here today. And so it's important to remain mindful of what you are doing. And recognizing whether your organization has inclusivity in the curriculum and the events that you have, right? Even in the support groups that you have. And so recognizing that trans folks sometimes would prefer a sacred space, just like people of color would prefer a sacred space, right? And so if your organization has groups based on certain identities, if you have a women's group, if you have a men's group, are trans folks accepted there? Is that explicitly said so that someone can access the services? Do you have a queer friendly group that they can go to, or should you create one? You want to promote freedom of gender expression, right? So commenting on why someone is dressed a certain way or anything like that would be not promoting, right? You want them to have that freedom of gender expression and feel like they can be themselves. The more someone feels like they can be themselves in the therapy space or in the faith community space, the more apt they are to talk through things and to be honest and to stop holding secrets. You want to advocate for policy too. Figure out what the discrimination policies look like where you are working, and advocate that there should be policy to protect these individuals who are trying to have access to space, right? Advocate for gender neutral bathrooms, at least one, right? And even I'm in North Carolina. I know we've passed a lot of wonky rules here. And so something that I notice is that most organizations will have one gender neutral bathroom that just has one stall there, right? And so recognizing, do we have a male bathroom? Do we have a female bathroom? Is there another single stall bathroom that we can use and label it as gender neutral to make sure that we are not being excluded, that we are not excluding folks from coming into our space, right? So be mindful about that. The next thing is going to be learning the language, right? You want to be able to learn certain language and drop certain language. And so learning the language is understanding what cisgender means, understanding what transgender, non-binary, gender spectrum, gender queer, gender fluid, understanding and having some in-depth learning about what those words mean. And that expands to asking about someone's family, asking about someone's chosen family as opposed to biological family. That expands to asking someone about their parents as opposed to assuming that they have a mom and dad. Asking about someone's partner as opposed to, or spouse, as opposed to asking, do you have a boyfriend, do you have a girlfriend, wife, husband, and using all of these gendered language, not realizing that that might be stopping some of the conversation that happens. And dropping the language, right? Dropping some of this heteronormative language that we tend to use when working with folks and working with clients. And that even includes paperwork, right? Is your paperwork expansive in the language that we're using? Are you asking people if they are going by a certain name or a different name? And recognizing the bias that goes there too, right? I have many clients who, let's say, have a preferred name or have a name that they want to use, and maybe someone will go out of their way to not use it, right? But how many Nicoles do we know that go by Nikki, right? How many people do we have that go by shortening their name and we don't have a problem with it? And so just recognizing the bias that can be there when we're asking about learning language and we're asking about dropping language. And so I really hope that you all got a really good understanding of what gender and sexual diversity really means today. For information on any speaking workshops, any training, consultations, or anything like that, you can just email me at adriennemichellemft@gmail.com. Or you can keep in touch through my website, adriennemichelletherapy.com, or follow me on Instagram at adriennemichelletherapy. I really hope that we have a good understanding of how, as faith leaders, you all can bridge the gap in understanding and be a mindful participant in learning the language and dropping the language and really connecting with this community. There's a huge, huge correlation between substance users, between LGBTQ communities, and those who are connected and have been disconnected with their faith communities. And I think it's great that you all are taking this webinar, and I hope that you take everything that you've learned today and use it to the best of your ability to provide adequate and amazing culturally competent services to those of you who are serving as clinicians. And if you have any questions, you can also send those to my email address. As I talked with the leaders of this webinar, I would be more than happy to answer those questions and send those all to you directly. Thank you so much for being here today, and I hope you all have a good one.